you analyze the Mesopotamian creation myth by saying the Genesis cosmology bestows upon human beings an exclusive kind of dignity, a dignity rooted in their roles as image bearers. Genesis recognizes the duality of humankind, male and female. This difference is part of the goodness of creation, and both sexes share fully in the divine image and the commission to tend the earth. There is no sense of hierarchy here between male and female, but rather a shared benevolent governance over the rest of the creation. Would you mind just explaining the dichotomy between the Enuma Elish and Genesis, and why Genesis comes out on top?
Sure. So the Enuma Elish, I didn't just kind of pick an arbitrary myth to compare it to, but the Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation myth, Mesopotamian creation myth. And so particularly in Genesis 1, when it was likely written, would have been in the context of the Babylonian exile. So essentially it's an attempt to demythologize the Babylonian creation myth, right? So it's almost this direct counter to the Enuma Elish. And you can see it when you compare, especially Genesis 1, when God begins to create the heavens and the earth, right? So you really, I think, begin to see the particular emphases of Genesis 1 only when you kind of put it against the backdrop of the Enuma Elish, right? So when we compare these things, we see a lot of differences. But in the Enuma Elish, there's this whole long prelude about the creation of the gods. And almost all creation narratives are like this too, which highlights the uniqueness of Genesis 1 because God's already there. God exists. There is no progenitor to God. Whereas in the Enuma Elish, it's Marduk who's the creator God. So Marduk is kind of the Yahweh counterpart. But we have to have this whole long story about how even Marduk came to be, right? And so there's these like primordial beings, I guess. Tiamat is this sort of feminine divine principle. And basically she and Marduk have this cosmic battle where he kills her. And then as this afterthought, like he's kind of, just purged his like battle rage, and he's looking at her corpse and he's like, wow, what can I do with this? And he creates the universe out of her corpse. So he creates the heavens and the earth out of her corpse. And he kills her consort, and out of that slain God's blood, he creates human beings to be slaves, right? So all of these things contrast so much with the creation stories in Genesis. So human beings are an afterthought. The creation of the world is an afterthought. And our purpose as human beings is to be slaves and serve the gods. So the Genesis elevation of human beings as the culmination of God's creative work, and the fact that they bear God's image, expresses, again, this idea of human dignity. And one thing that I think is really important is that the Genesis creation accounts are very interested in sexual difference, right? In both the first creation account in Genesis 1 and the second creation account in Genesis 2, the climax of the creation story is not just the creation of human beings, but the sexual differentiation of human beings in both creation accounts. And we get that really emphasized in the second one, as I've described before, because we have this whole climactic telling of how human beings became sexually differentiated. And that sexual differentiation creates this capacity for communion, for relationship, without which, we're not right, like this original solitude of the earthling. We're made for love. We're made to give and receive love, and sexual difference is a sign of that. And if you compare Genesis to other creation accounts, you really can't find any other creation myth that, one, cares so much about sexual difference, and two, presents it as something positive rather than something gone wrong, right? So a lot of creation myths posit woman as almost like this kind of deformed afterthought, or that the natural state of men and women is conflict and division, or subservience and domination. But in the Genesis account, that dynamic is a corruption of the original dynamic between men and women. So there's this unique dignity that's given to sexual differentiation in Genesis.
Yeah, and downstream of that founding mythology, the cultural practices which grow out of that, they're uniquely respectful of the complementarianism naturally arising between men and women, and that creates for a much more healthy society. However, if you then decide to culturally regress, we've killed God in the Nietzschean sense, we've technologically disembodied ourselves, and then suddenly you introduce Beauvoir's feminist existentialism to this, you get to the place of the chaotic devouring dragon mother being the spirit of current culture. And I said this earlier in a discussion on the concept of love with my colleague Stelios. In her embodiment of the kind of Tiamatian dragon figure, this devouring dragon of female sexuality that spawns forth waves of successive feminism to drown the world, she's regressing us back to that place of chaos. What is chaos? Unmitigated potential. And it's very nihilistic, because if you don't have a schema for ordering that chaos, you just get lost in it. And I think the plethora of options opened up to both sexes, despecified from sex now, the amount of jobs, travel opportunities, fear of missing out, arrested development in education, social opportunities, pathologizing commitment as catching feelings, we're kind of lost in that chaos, that cultural milieu. And so it's very difficult to try and reach out and create something in your own. But you wrote this great little paragraph in isolation, and I think you put it even better than I do. Here we are, bobbing in the wake of the fourth wave, although to be honest, by now the metaphor is broken down. We no longer have a movement that ebbs and recedes with interludes between distinct waves. We are the rolling ocean, fed by numerous streams like Tiamat, the tumultuous sea goddess from the Enuma Elish and her many squabbling progeny. So, what are your critiques of Beauvoir's feminism then?
Well, I think Simone de Beauvoir, you can see in The Second Sex this ironic, implicit masculine bias in modern feminism. In other words, this framing that it is better to be as much like a man as possible. And so what really holds women back is their femaleness, right? And this is really pronounced in her existentialist framework, because for her, as an existentialist, the whole purpose of being human, what it means to be human or become human, is to transcend the facticity of our existence. So the way she describes men and women in their natural state, even prior kind of to more complex modern societies, is that women are enslaved to the species. That's how she puts it. So she describes she describes this like kind of fictional or sort of pseudo-historical tribal setting, right, where male activity is described in these very like active, positive ways, whereas female activities of like breastfeeding and childbirth are described in these like limiting and oppressive language, right? So for her, and you can see this especially in the very last word of her book, which I just find so fascinating, that she chooses to end The Second Sex with the word brotherhood, and that's her solution, right? Is this Marxist utopia where men and women can together reclaim their brotherhood, because it's the male model, right? It's the masculine model. So women have to, she describes at pretty much every aspect of female physiology as pathological. It's really wild to read some of her descriptions of, periods and gestation and lactation. And the one chapter, though, that I will say I think is really good and that she's right on about is her chapter on the independent woman, where she writes about how in modern society, a woman basically has to perform as both a perfect man and a perfect woman simultaneously, and that creates this really kind of anxious and distressing state to be in. And I think there's something to that, right, in our contemporary society, because women are supposed to, be in the world. We're supposed to be girl bosses. We're supposed to be like badass cops on TV who are like chasing down criminals in high heels, right? But we're also supposed to be super sexy while we do it. And, so we're supposed to be like this like sex icon, but also this like powerful CEO, right? And like all, so this being able to kind of perform both and both of those things neglect, I think, what is like the kind of natural potentialities of femaleness when it comes to motherhood, right? None of those things, none of those ideals, like all of those ideals basically are an attempt to escape motherhood. And so I really think that is a big part of Simone de Beauvoir's legacy, is that is that framing of what oppresses women, and that the solution is a kind of Marxist society in which women have unfettered access to abortion and birth control.
Yeah, in increasing women's grasp on the world, as she would put it, it's become a bit of a chokehold over the culture, and it's siphoning off our differences. When you were talking about the ass-kicking female superhero stereotype, the immediate idea that it brought to me was Charlize Theron in Atomic Blonde, which featured her kicking giant henchmen down the stairs and hitting a man in the stiletto in the back of a cab until he's unconscious. And it immediately makes me contrast to Charlize Theron, who's very successful, very attractive woman in her personal life, saying men need to step up because I'm in my mid-40s and I can't get a date. And it's like saying, well, yes, of course, if you try to displace the role of a man, you're going to limit the amount of men available to you that are excellent enough for you to respect and be attracted to them. So don't deny sex specification and you won't price yourself out of the market, so to speak. And I think that's a very astute point that you've made there, contrasting natural femininity to this pastiche of hypermasculinity that Beauvoir seems to have wanted many women to inhabit. If she did identify that the modern woman is put in an impossible role, I don't see how making every woman the modern woman was a particularly great approach. But maybe I'm just a misogynist.
Well, her approach is the Marxist approach, right? So in her approach, she's kind of critiquing basically the state of the modern woman under capitalism, right? And so there's something to that critique, right? I think there's something about our consumerist culture that has impoverished scripts about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. So I think her critique there is apt, even though I really, reject her, certainly the way she portrays femaleness and also her solution. So the way she frames the problem and her solution, I disagree with. But there's something to her critique about the modern woman.
Well, I think actually going on a detour about commodification then, I think it's correct to identify the fact that contemporary culture is hypersexualized and has a lot of perverse incentives for women to use youth and beauty, not for their intended purpose of being attached to fertility and also cultivating the character to make you a good mother and a lifelong partner to a man who will protect and provide for you, but instead to bait a legion of simps on Twitter and OnlyFans. And so she's correct in her assessment that the commodification, if you want to call it just capitalism, the Marxist conception, is bad for sexual differences and unhealthy for women. But then to abolish the metaphysical constraints that keep activities between human beings virtuous, aka Christianity, that wasn't very sensible, because from my perspective, the most hyper-industrious time of the UK, at least, was Victorian Britain. We had leaps and bounds in productivity and innovation, but we also had plenty of Christian charity and plenty of sensibilities of propriety here. So you need both, and just throwing God out is like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and you wonder why, well, the whole world's drowning.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.